and running? Off and running. Okay.
I think that should be a board decision.
So, the joy of going to an optometrist. We all have been there, I think, looking around this room. It's actually not part of the admission policy that you have to wear glasses to come to the class, but it looks like that's option. So you know the great thing they do when they put the little thing across your face and they say number 1, number 2, number 1, number 2, and then flick, 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 number 1, number 2. Right, it's a lot of fun. So we're gonna play which one's harder for some commandments, because we're in Kedoshim, which means we've got a whole bunch of commandments, but there's commandments all over the place. 613 throughout the Torah, and different people find different commandments easier and harder. So, for example, murder versus no bacon. Which one's the harder commandment to keep?
No bacon.
Murder.
It's harder not to murder?
No bacon.
I can stay away from bacon, no problem,
Exactly.
but I kill people on a weekly basis.
No way.
Or I don't think I would ever be guilty of murder, but bacon? Okay, so we'll use the good old math sign. So that's the harder one, maybe for many people to avoid. Okay. What about theft? Gossip.
Gossip is harder because it's so available.
Gossip is it's instantly available. It's at our fingertips and our lips quite readily.
It's an industry.
But theft is also quite easy to do.
But gossip can be
Hurtful.
described as fun sometimes.
It's easier to
People enjoy gossip.
it's easier
Which
to
is why they do.
It's insidious.
it's insidious.
It
It's
works its way into a conversation.
it's self-justifying. It has its own reward features of social interaction, and it can be justified for lots of really
And
stretching it, but
gossip is
reasons.
judgmental, what some people call exchange of information
Mhm.
about people is not always gossip.
All right, I'll give you that one. I'll give you that one.
And the other thing is
No, it isn't. Not if I'm saying, oh, did you hear that so and so?
that no
is at
bacon
the
and
hospital
gossip.
that You ought to go visit.
no bacon and gossip are personal things. Murder and theft are civil crimes.
True.
Easier.
But gossip is, at least in the Jewish conception, also a civil crime. You have
Yeah,
damaged
but-
another
but-
person.
But it's not punishable the way murder and theft are, beyond.
Not
personal-
quite the same way. I'm going to check and
personal
see, because that
conscience.
may be Penelope telling me there's a problem.
Yeah, it's a civil thing. It's liable.
No, we seem to be okay.
Gossip is liable.
All right,
Well, it doesn't have
let's
to
move
be.
on. Let's try
No, not all gossip is liable. It should be.
Shabbat observance. So, for example, not lighting fires, not writing, not building, all of the malachot that we don't do on Shabbat. Be there. Versus, where's my verses on? Right. Pesach, keeping the holiday of Passover. No leavening, matzah, having the Seder, all of that. Pesach starter?
I think Pesach is easier because it only lasts a week. Shabbat is forever.
And every week. Right? We have 52 days of Shabbat a year. Right? 52 weeks in a year. That means we got 52 Shabbats a year, which we got 7 plus 1 because we're in the diaspora. So we have 8 days of Passover. But Passover always has at least one Shabbat, sometimes 2 like it did this year. And Passover has at least 2, and in the diaspora 4 days of Chag, which are almost Shabbat for their limits on what we can do.
It's more exhausting to prepare for. Yeah.
All right, so that may be
It's all compacted.
there's not just the week of Passover, there are the weeks of preparation for Passover.
Where mentally I'm starting to think back in January or February, should I buy this? Should Should I not buy it?
I know the feeling, or rather my household knows the feeling. As Penelope tells us, when we finish this box of Triscuits, we're not getting any more.
So for me, Pesach is.
But I know many people who don't observe anything,
Mhm.
but do observe Passover in their dietary restrictions.
True.
And for them, it's just something they do.
So hard or not, they have to do it.
They want to do.
Right, right. Well, I mean, they feel very attached to the performance.
Exactly. And our family in Israel is very sectarian.
So
But
this,
they do observe Pesach.
so that may be a
as far as
very,
food
yeah,
is concerned.
that may be a very open one then, depending upon the person. Maybe hard to draw a consensus of harder versus easy. What about this one? Love God, love people. Because we're commanded to do both.
Equal.
Which one's harder?
Susan says.
It's harder to love
No,
people.
I think she said equal.
Oh.
She said
I'm sorry,
equal.
I thought you said equal.
They're equally easy or equally hard?
Easy.
It's harder to love people because we actually know them. God is an abstraction in my mind.
I don't have a fence with God between them we have to argue over. God doesn't cut his lawn.
God's been pretty okay with me, doesn't argue. I think it's harder to love people,
All right, well,
I'd agree.
but that's my opinion.
No, Mike agrees.
that's what we're going to get to because we are in Kedoshim. We are in chapter 19 of the book of Leviticus, the book that is notorious for just having all those boring rules and priestly laws and all of that, and which also contains some of the most profound calls for ethical, moral, and emotional spirituality throughout the entire Torah. So for all those people out there who, when they see Leviticus start with sacrifices, skip it and jump all the way to the book of Numbers, and then skip that when it starts with the census, stop and read. Because there are parts, even if you're uncomfortable with the sacrificial things and priestly rites, there are parts in here that everybody should read and know and take to heart. And we're going to take one of the most famous and we're going to dig deep. But let's get a little bit of a general reading first. 693, Parashat Kedoshim, beginning with chapter 19, verse 1. And I need a volunteer. Don't worry, I'm not going to saw you in half. Edie, thanks.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the whole Israelite community and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy."
All right, Kedoshim Tihiyu, right? You will be holy. It's one of the most famous proclamations in the entire Torah that we are not just doing stuff, that we are reaching for holiness through the performance of all of these commandments, that there is something more going on than simply obeying the speed limit.
You shall each revere his mother and his father, and keep my Sabbaths. I, the Lord, am your God.
Which one's easier? That's okay. It's a loaded question, but an interesting set of commandments to start off on this this journey of showing revere, awe, reverential treatment to mother and father, as well as to also keep Shabbat. Onward.
Do not turn to idols or make molten gods for yourselves. I, the Lord, am your God. When you
Good.
sacrifice an offering of well-being to the Lord, sacrifice it so that it may be accepted on your behalf. It shall be eaten on the day you
Hold on a second. I think a phone's going. It's got a nice rhythm.
Easy to ask.
Oh, and it's done. Keep going, Edie.
It shall be eaten on the day you sacrifice it, or on the day following, but what is left by the third day must be consumed in fire. If it should be eaten on the third day, it is an offensive thing. It will not be acceptable. And he who eats of it shall bear his guilt, for he has profaned what is sacred to the Lord that person shall be cut off from his kin.
All right, so we've had family relations, we've had Shabbat, we've had idolatry and the idea of God, and we've now had some sacrificial regulations.
This again seems, the song, let the punishment fit the crime.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the punishment fits the crime.
You mean for the sacrificial?
Yeah.
So the underlying issue here is the underlying thought behind it. That sacrifices, in particular, were a form of expression of our spirituality that, if allowed to be done in any way, shape, or form as we were feeling it in the moment, would very easily move us away from God. And by saying that you will be cut off, again, which according to our tradition doesn't mean you're going to be shunned, it means you have removed yourself spiritually from God.
That's a lot different.
Well,
That you will be cut off from the kin.
well, it says you will be cut off, you will be excised from your nation, right? And you have done that. I mean, if you are one who will worship in a way that is inappropriate, you're missing the point that we are connected together by being connected to God, right? And worship is one of the most fundamental ways we show that connection. And if you don't understand that, if you don't see that worship is meant to bind us together, but you're just going to go do your own thing, you've already made your decision of where you stand. So don't be surprised by the repercussions. All right, onward.
When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not pick your vineyard bare, or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I, the Lord, am your God.
All right, so this is where we get the corners of the field that were left for the poor, as well as the sheets that were forgotten or dropped, to be collected by those who come later. In particular, this passage is then used as the foundation for the story of the book of Ruth, where Ruth becomes one of the poor gleaners that is going through the fields on behalf of herself and her mother-in-law, Naomi. And it ends up with a nice marriage.
You shall not steal, you shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name, profaning the name of your God. I am the Lord your God. You shall not defraud your fellow. You shall not commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning.
By the way, just as a quick caveat, if you've agreed to pay the person that day, you're not allowed to hold their salary longer. That doesn't mean you can't pay people monthly or weekly. It just means if you hire someone to work for you today and you say, when you finish work, I'll give you $20, you give him $20 when he finishes work. You don't say, I'll pay you tomorrow, because he came and worked for you today so that he could be paid today. And if you hold off on that, then you have robbed him of his chance to work for someone else who could have paid him the money he needed today for his needs. So it doesn't mean, again, that you can't pay on a weekly scale. You can, as long as that's agreed upon by worker and employer.
Beautiful, beautiful.
It's an amazing collection, isn't it?
It really is.
Apparently being holy means we keep Shabbat, we do the sacrifices right, and we help the poor, and we pay our employees right.
And you're fair to people.
And you're fair to people. It's an interesting expansion of what it means to be holy, because most people seem to think holiness only happens within formal religious institutions and ceremonies, that if I'm not, wearing a talit and tefillin, that I must not be holy at the moment. And yet this is saying, no, holiness is something that is generated constantly by our actions in many, many different realms of life, pretty much all of life. Edie, onward. We still haven't got to the good stuff.
You shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord.
Just as a quick side teaching, the reminder to be in fear or in awe of God in that particular commandment and a few others is pointed to by our sages to say, the person who is deaf won't know you have mocked them because they are deaf. The person who is blind won't know you have tripped them because they're blind. Therefore, these are crimes that people are more likely to commit because they don't have to worry about vengeance or some retaliation. Therefore, think of God even if you're not thinking of the person. If you wouldn't do it out of self-interest, do it out of an understanding that there is one who hears your mocking, there is one who sees what you're doing. That's called God. Onward.
You shall not render an unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kinsmen fairly. Do not deal basely with your countrymen. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow. I am the Lord.
And that's a very important set of principles for having a proper justice system and interaction between people. The last line there of do not profit by the blood of your countrymen, or do not deal basely with them. There have been other translations of those phrases that you might be more familiar with. Do not go out as a talebearer is what they're translating as deal basely. That's the prohibition on gossip. And the do not profit by the blood of your fellow is literally says do not stand upon the blood of your fellow, which often is translated more as being do not stand idly by the blood of someone else, meaning if you can render help to someone in need, you are obligated to give help. That you can't just say, not my problem. That you have to engage. But of course, not profiting through someone else's misery is also prohibited. It's just in translation, you got to pick one. And the translator did that. All right.
You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. Reprove your kinsman, but incur no guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against your countrymen. Love your fellow as yourself. I am the Lord.
And one more, just the beginning.
You shall observe my laws.
All right, we're going to leave it there. There are many, many, many more laws that come throughout the rest of Kedoshim. You should be reading them. That's actually one of the laws in general from the Torah. But what about that last little paragraph of not hating in your heart, to reprove, that is to say, to point out, to rebuke someone for doing wrong, and to not taking vengeance, to bear guilt, and to love your fellow as yourself. Ehavta l're'echa kamocha. Three very famous words, which sound so much better in the Hebrew than the 5 clunky English. Easy or hard? Not taking vengeance, not hating, not bearing a grudge, loving somebody as yourself. It's just all just hippy-dippy stuff. All hard? All hard?
What I find interesting, that it says, you should not hate your kinsfolk in your heart. You can reprove them, though.
Exactly.
So it seems that if you're dealing, I know kinsmen could be general population, family, whatever. It's quite all right to express your disaffection or your disapproval, but you need to do it in a way that does not bring shame. And of course, that's very important because I think so many huge cataclysmic things have occurred because of people's having been forced to lose face or to be insulted.
Right.
But still in all, it doesn't say be quiet about things that you see are improper, but need to do it in a diplomatic kind of way.
So as Barbara points out,
I think is very, very insightful.
So as Barbara points out, I mean, look at the beauty of the Torah. It could have, as we've seen in the sort of random collection, what appears to be random collections of laws, it could have skipped the rebuke somebody part and just had don't hate them, don't have vengeance, don't bear a grudge, love them as yourself, and moved on. But it snuck in this little line that said, but you are allowed to tell them when they do something wrong. In fact, you must tell them when they do something wrong, which on the surface for many of us would seem to be antithetical. You know, we tell people when they're doing something wrong precisely because we hate them, or precisely because we're bearing a grudge, or because we want to take vengeance. And we allow the way we criticize them to be our vehicle for that vengeance and grudge or anger. And yet this is sandwiching the whole concept together, meaning that this is a bundle of emotions that all have to work properly in unison.
We hear of families that have, where members haven't spoken to one another years or longer. And my father and his 4 brothers were in business together for a few years. They could fight and scream and yell and carry on all day long. But once they walked out of that shop and were socializing,
Right.
it was as though nothing that day had happened.
Of course not.
Because they were brothers.
Right. Right. You disagreeing with me over what we should buy for the store or what price we should put on something doesn't mean you don't like me. It just means you think you know better about the product, as it should be. I mean that's the type of discussions we should have, and we can fight to the tooth and nail, because I'm not fighting you. I'm just fighting this. All right. Let's go ahead, because it's hard to answer the question of what does it mean in particular to love people when we don't know what we're actually being commanded to do. Love your neighbor as yourself. Great sentence. What does that actually mean? Right? Does that mean I can't tell the difference between where I stop and you begin? Does that mean I have to buy you a house the same way I buy myself a house? Does that mean I have to tuck you in at bed at night? Or what does this mean? What does it mean to do this? And surprisingly enough, our tradition has a variety of opinions. I know, we're all shocked.
I have to just tell you that my grandfather said to me,
Mhm.
do you know why it says love your neighbor as yourself? I said, no, because it isn't easy.
Exactly right. As the old joke goes, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it. All right.
Julie and I have discussed this many times.
Mm.
We've reached this conclusion. The approach that you need to know who you are,
Mm-hmm.
what love is, and who your neighbor is before you can love your neighbor.
So that means you never have to do anything. Because I never know myself, really. I don't really understand love, and who knows what that person is.
It means you need to be aware of who you are, what the love means, as you're just pointing out, and who your neighbor.
So let's see what some of the general interpretations of this are before we get into the messy details.
It is a positive commandment to visit the sick, comfort the mourning, to remove the dead, to bring in the bride, to escort guests, and to occupy oneself with all the needs of burial, carrying the coffin on one shoulder, to walk in front of him, to eulogize, to dig, and to bury, as well as to make the bride and groom happy, and to take care of all their needs. And these are Gimilut
Chasadim.
that are done with one's body, that have no measurement.
Now, no measurement here means that there is no minimum amount that needs to be done. They just need to be done. And there is no maximal amount beyond which you don't need to, you can stop. These are of infinite need, right? So any amount is good and every amount is good. You can do all of these and should do all of these to the fullest ability possible available to you. But these aren't listed in the Torah. If you read through the Torah, these statements are not listed individually as commandments. Nowhere in the Torah does it say, you will escort guests when they are leaving your domain. Nowhere does it say, you will make the bride and groom happy, as a thou shalt kind of sentence. So how do we get this?
Although all these are rabbinic laws, they are included under love your neighbor as yourself, meaning that all things that you would like others to do for you, you should do for your brother.
All right, so Rambam, this is from his Mishnah Torah, based upon our tradition, says yes, the full details are listed only among the rabbinic writings rather than explicitly in the Torah, but all of them are derived from this phrase of love your neighbor as yourself. Love your fellow as yourself. But there's a number of different translations that I go, neighbor, favor, fellow, other. So all of these are contained within that one term, because that one term, according to our tradition, could be rendered as what you would like done, do for others. Or what is hateful to you, don't do to others. And Rambam's using the more proactive phrasing of that here. And think for a second about how this list lines up. Most of the things that are happening here are things you can't do for yourself. Right? I can't bury myself. Right? We all agree on that? No matter how things work out, the one thing I definitely can't do is I cannot bury myself. I can't visit myself when I'm sick. I can't provide comfort to myself when I am a mourner. I cannot give a eulogy to myself. I cannot make myself happy when I am the groom. That is to say, I can't add to my joy by coming and celebrating with myself. All of these are things that have to be done by other people for me. I am dependent upon them for these to be done. And what Rambam is pointing is that's what it means, in one level, to love your neighbor as yourself. I would like these things to be done for me. I'd like to know that at some point when I pass, someone will bury me. That is something that would really, really make me happy to know that that's going to happen. And because I recognize how important that is to me, when I see my fellow, I will feel that need for him or her as well. See how that sort of self-reflection and leading to a reciprocal action. But also note that for many of these, the people I am helping are not necessarily the people who will do it for me. Right? When I bury someone who's dead, I'm not expecting them to get up and bury me when I die. That would be creepy. Right? When I visit somebody who's sick, that doesn't necessarily mean when I get sick, I'm expecting that precise person to come and visit me when I'm sick. These are things that we do for others because they are other human beings. And we hope that other human beings, not even necessarily the ones that we helped, will do for us when it is our turn, so to speak. Make sense? Fairly self-evident set of things that most of us, I imagine, around the room would say, yes, those are reasonable expectations. It's a reasonable application of loving your neighbor as yourself. There are things that you can't do for yourself that you would like done. You do them for others, and when it's your turn, others will do them for you.
In recent years, I've noticed in the news that there are acts of kindness that somebody will do for somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And
it makes the news.
Yes, it does.
Yes.
And then they, payback is refused
Mm-hmm.
with the comment, just
Pass it
pass it on.
Yep, pay it forward,
Do
pass it
something
on,
nice
right.
for somebody
Pass it
else.
forward.
Yeah, exactly right.
Pay it forward.
Yeah, pay it forward, pass it on, exactly. You help someone when it is your turn, exactly right. And that's perfectly in keeping with this principle.
And it makes you feel so good.
Absolutely,
It does.
absolutely. All right. But there are other ways to look at this.
The nations of the ancient world would only love their own people, and they would defraud other peoples because they saw them as despicable foreigners. Therefore, it says here that you need to love him like yourself and act toward him just as you would want. You should act towards him as you would want other people to act towards you if you were a foreigner. This is in accord with what was written several verses earlier. Love your neighbor as yourself.
So Shadal is commenting on verse 34, which we didn't read together because it's another 20 verses on, about the idea of loving the stranger, of taking care of the stranger among you. And he's saying taking care of the stranger is the same connection to taking care of your neighbor. And what he's doing here is saying, from our first paragraph, you might imagine that if you have a group of people that are all in the same community, that there is a certain expectation, like we said, of reciprocal kindness, right? These are my neighbors, and I'm good to him because he's good to him, and that comes back to me, and it all works out, and that's what loving your neighbor like yourself means. It's a sort of communal expectation. We build up social capital that is stored and used for all the members collectively when needed. But what Shadal is saying is that by adding in the idea of also liking the foreigners, those people, that what happens is I'm also supposed to help these guys over here, even though they're strangers to me, even though they're not part of this expected network. You all right, Martha? Okay. Well, this is a difficult concept to choke on, because the principle here is, at least in our first text, is somewhat predicated on reciprocity, certain expectations of compensation, that I'm better off because I helped him, because in the long run, it'll come back to me. This is saying, no, what I do for him is going to stay in his sphere, because he's a foreigner. He's going to go back to his country someday, and the social capital that I have invested in him is going to be exported. And when I end up going to this other country and I become a foreigner there when I'm traveling on whatever journey, I can't expect there to be an overlap. Right? So my investment over here disappears. So why am I doing it?
Because it's the godly thing to do.
Because it's the godly thing to do. So what Shadal is trying to say is that especially by tying in the notion of helping the stranger, the foreigner, what the Torah is trying to say is, yes, there is a practical level to love your neighbor as yourself. But there is also a ethereal level, a holy level, that is, you're helping them because it is the right thing to do, because it is the godly thing to do, even when there is no expectation of reciprocity, of it coming back. That the loving your neighbor like yourself means you have sympathy for their condition, even if that sympathy will never translate back as a payoff to yourself. Just because you understand what it's like to be a foreigner. You understand what it's like, and if you were in that situation, wouldn't you like someone to do this for you too? Make sense? Sort of moves it to this next level, maybe? Okay. Onward, Edie. Let's make it a little bit more complicated.
It is a commandment upon every person to love each and every Jew as himself, as it is said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself.
Now, this is, by the way, from Rambam, from the same guy who wrote the first paragraph that was looking a little bit more cut and dry reciprocity.
Therefore, one needs to speak praises of one and to be as careful with his money as one is with one's own money and desires his own honor. Whoever gains honor through diminishing his colleague has no portion in the world to come. The loving of a convert who came and entered under the wings of the Shekhinah comprises of two positive commandments, one because he is in the general group of fellows, and one because he is a convert, and the Torah said, and you shall love the convert.
All right, so Rambam introduces not just the, I'm going to scratch your back because then someone else will scratch mine. He introduces the idea that if you are not speaking well of each other, if you are not taking care of each other's dignity and honor, if you are not treating their property, which is what he's referring to by their money, with the same care that you would treat your own cash, you have no share in the world to come. That is to say, you have written yourself out of spiritual eternity if you are failing on these matters. That's like one of the heaviest hammers you can bring down in Jewish thinking about how bad is it to transgress something. It is like, what? But if you are not willing to do that, if you're not willing to show that kind of love and care and to speak well of others, what have you become? Then you are too mechanistic in your analysis. If you're only looking at this, if I'm scratching your back because eventually someone will scratch mine, and you're not willing to do all of these other things which don't necessarily have a payoff, then you have completely isolated yourself from any spiritual life or really any emotional life with other human beings. Make sense? And of course, with converts, it comes doubly in the Torah because we get told to love the convert and we're told to love our fellow, which means we got to love them doubly. And now he brings in what Barbara was pointing out of this interesting idea of not hating and not vengeance, and of also speaking rebuke.
Everyone who hates one from Israel in his heart transgresses a negative commandment, as it is written, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. There are no lashes for this negative commandment. because there is no act involved.
All right, so he does admit that if I go around saying I hate him, 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 they can't prosecute me for that. Now, God can hold me accountable, but the earthly court can't take me before the court and say, we have discovered that you hate so-and-so in your heart, therefore you are subject to the penalty. And for most of the ancient crimes, the penalty was a good flogging. Therefore, you are still not allowed to do it. Right? So that's what he's threading the line. He says you are prohibited from doing it, but the earthly court can't hold you accountable because there is no action involved with that internal hate.
But there is an action if you go around and say it. And it's like, hurrah. But so in your heart means inside of you.
Correct.
You can't just
Correct.
hate somebody you're thinking.
Correct. If you, you're right. If you are actually speaking ill of someone else, then yes. But if it were somehow determined that you hated the person, there still would be no punishment. If somehow, we had brain scanners or whatever you might imagine,
Right.
that somehow it slipped out, of just muttered under your breath, you thought you were alone, but somebody heard you, still you would not be punished by the earthly court. But you are held accountable by God for hating someone in your heart.
Unless you're Jimmy Carter and admitted that you lusted in your heart and told everybody, the evangelicals said, you're out of here.
Well, he himself did. He was confessing it on his own. It was his own belief system.
There was a consequence for him.
Yes.
Politically, and I guess within his faith group, which are evangelical Christians.
And that's
But
one
we're
reason.
not talking about evangelicals.
We're not. That's what I'm going to say. That's one reason why we don't consider things like that in the same way. Carry on, Edie.
The Torah warns only about hating in one's heart, but striking one's colleague or insulting him, even though it is not permissible, is not a transgression of you shall not hate.
All right. So that there are transgressions of violence and there are transgressions of hate. And an act of violence doesn't necessarily mean there's an act of hate going along with it. Right? I could punch you for lots of reasons, and hate is only one of them. And whether I hate you or not, I'm going to be punished for my fist hitting your face. I'm not going to be punished by the emotion. By the way, this is used sometimes for some Jewish groups to argue that hate crime legislation is not necessarily in keeping with Torah. That the intent behind the crime is not always a reason to exacerbate punishment. That the crime itself is the punishment. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't work very hard to stamp out hate. It doesn't mean that you can't work very hard to make the punishment work to eradicate the hate. But the idea that a crime instantly becomes worse just because the person had a socially recognized form of hatred is a controversial topic within Judaism. It's judging someone for their emotion more than their action. And we're not always so big on that, even though we're often the victim of that.
When one person sins against another, he should not hate him and be silent, as it says concerning the wicked ones. And Absalom did not speak to Amnon, neither bad nor good, because Absalom hated Amnon.
All right, we'll pause there. So Amnon raped Absalom's sister. It was Amnon's half sister as well. King David had a really messed up family. If you haven't read the book of Samuel, it's a very complicated soap opera. So what Rambam is trying to point out here is that what Absalom did was wrong because he kept silent. He hated his half-brother for raping his sister, but rather than confront him with it, rather than bring the matter to justice and to its closure, he simply didn't say good or bad. He just sat back, biding his time. He'll later murder him, murder his half-brother, but the point is that he harbored the hate rather than doing what he was supposed to do. And what was he supposed to do?
Rather, it is a mitzvah to inform him and say to him, why did you do this to me? Why did you wrong me in this way? For you shall surely rebuke your kinsman, and if he returns and asks forgiveness from him, he needs to forgive. The one forgiving should not be cruel, as it says, and Abraham prayed to God.
That's taken from the section with Abimelech, when Abimelech had taken Sarah when Abraham and she were down in their territory, and Abraham prayed on his behalf to cure the plague that was going around the household. So even though he'd done something wrong by taking Sarah, when he came and asked forgiveness, Abraham prayed on his behalf. So the idea here is that these are all intertwined, right? You don't hate someone, you rebuke them. That the opposite of rebuke is not letting it go. The opposite of rebuke for most people is hating in your heart. If you don't tell someone that you're upset with them, then you just keep the upset in here, because you never allow it to reach the point where they will know that there was a problem, how you feel about it, and how to then fix it. And then you'll be able to offer forgiveness, and then things can be returned to a proper state. Make sense? So silent grudges, not the Jewish response. Happens a lot, but it's not what it's supposed to be. Okay, let's keep pushing, because this all seems too easy, right?
All other transgressions against one's fellow man are objectively immoral, except for revenge, which seems like justice. Therefore, love your fellow as yourself.
All right, so Shadal gives this beautiful little intro here, and we'll go into more detail, but he's like, look, when I tell someone, don't punch the guy next to you, don't steal his stuff, don't sleep with his wife, don't fail to return his lost sheep. We can all, more or less rational people around the world, objectively say, yeah, doing that kind of thing to another human being, yeah, I think we can all kind of agree that that's wrong, right? You have damaged the other person for no good reason. But vengeance, revenge, by its nature, they've done me wrong. By its nature, they deserve some comeuppance for whatever it is they did, right? So I am justified. It is justice that I am doing, and therefore my revenge is fine. And in order to blunt that self-rationalization, Shadal points out that the Torah puts love your neighbor as yourself smack dab in the same framing as don't bear a grudge or seek revenge. Because the only antidote to seeking revenge is this love your fellow as yourself. Because otherwise you just think it's justice. And when it's justice, well, anything goes. So let's see how he argues this.
Just like you don't want others to take revenge on you, so you should not take revenge on your fellow, even though you are in the right to take revenge.
Notice he's not saying you don't have just cause. He's not saying you're not right. Case by case, yes, sometimes we do delude ourselves into thinking we're right when we really aren't. But even if you are right, that they deserve X, Y, and Z to happen to them, don't do it. Using the actual justice apparatus, the proper system of courts and laws, no problem. But seeking personal and private revenge, don't do it, even if you're right.
And so too, in all other ways, you should love your fellow as you love yourself. And Moses Mendelssohn interpreted it as, you shall love your fellow in all the ways of love that you love yourself, equal in quality of love and not in its quantity, whenever there is no conflict between two beloved things.
Okay, well, sorry, pause there. There should have been end quotes. Oh no, the end quotes came earlier. But so Moses Mendelssohn says, Shadal, interpret it like this. Love your neighbor as yourself means love your neighbor in the same sorts of things that you would love yourself, but not as much as you love yourself. Because as we said, if I buy myself a house, do I have to buy you a house? If I buy myself a car, do I have to buy you a car? And Mendelssohn was saying, no. If you have a house, you should hope that other people have houses too, but you don't have to go around giving out houses.
Wouldn't respect be a better word than love?
Well, for Mendelssohn, yes. Because what Mendelssohn says is you don't have to love them as much as you love yourself. Mm-hmm. Just love them in the same style of things. But also only if there's no conflict. Meaning only if it doesn't come at any cost to yourself. Yeah. And Shadal has a problem with that.
However, that's similar to the trait of a sodomite. What What's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine,
Right.
is yours.
Very famous passage from
I thought
Pirkei Avot.
What's mine is mine, and what's yours is also mine.
Yeah, that's the true evil person, right? Is what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine. And the true chassid is what is yours, and what is mine is yours. And what is first trotted out as being, just kind of middle of the road is what's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours. But the rabbis in Pirkei Avot say no. That is the attitude of Sodom. Sodom was more famous for these moral failings than they were for what the term has come to mean in English. And just saying, you got yours, I got mine, and we're even, is not love. And it's not even necessarily proper respect, because you're not recognizing that that person may need more than what they currently have, and that there is a connection between you that obligates you to help someone else in need, even if you didn't put them in need. And that's what the Sodomites didn't understand. That someone starving in the street, someone who was wounded and dying, even if you didn't steal their food, even if you didn't wound them, they do have the right expectation to imagine that you will help. And you can't just say, hey, I didn't do it. Why should I be responsible for fixing it? Onward.
Or how can I benefit my fellow without causing myself loss or effort, light or heavy? For there will always be a conflict between my benefit and other people's benefit. And there is no way to give
A pruta, like a penny.
to my friend without losing a peruta from my pocket.
Right? So he points out the truth. Helping someone else will always come at a cost to you. Now, the cost may only be a little effort. The cost may only be a little time. And that may be a very easy cost, and I hope that it, definitely it doesn't put anyone off, but recognize you are paying something. Right? As you mentioned about paying it forward or helping others in need, and it feels so good, and sometimes it takes very little to do, but it does something to do. You do have to try if you are going to show love to a fellow. It doesn't just happen with no cost to you. And that's what Shadal is trying to remind us. And that's a good thing, right? Because once we have an expectation that showing love to others, that being good to others comes with a cost, we won't begrudge the cost when it shows up, right? When you take someone out to dinner, you won't be shocked when their food shows up on your bill. It's expected. That I knew I was getting into that when I started helping them. When I'm giving someone a lift, to their house, I'm not surprised that my gas tank goes down and that I used an extra 20 minutes to do it. And I'm okay with that, because I went into it knowing that helping comes with a cost. And that's why God has to command us to do these things and prepare us emotionally and spiritually for understanding that this is a worthwhile expenditure, that what we are investing here is exactly what we should be. Onward. That's
The
right.
phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, cannot be meant literally, since man cannot be expected to love his neighbor as himself.
All right, so Ramban going to put a little bit of a twist on this to make sure that we understand we're not going completely loopy in loving people exactly the way we love ourselves. Again, this is a way to say, I'm not buying a house for you the same way I bought a house for myself, without going down the Mendelssohn road of, hey, what you got is okay and what I got is okay. So Ramban is going to give us another path.
Moreover, Rabbi Akiva has ruled that your life comes first.
All right, a very famous section in the Talmud. You're traveling through the desert. You have a bottle of water, and there's only enough water to help you survive to get to the other end of the desert, and you're traveling with another person. Do you have to share the water with them and both of you die?
That's not what this is saying.
No. Well, what Rabbi Akiva says is no. Your life comes first. If it's your water, you are allowed to use your water to preserve your life and not die along with the other person. If you have shared water, you're not allowed to beat them up and take the water. And if they have water, you're not allowed to beat them up and take their water so you can survive. But if there is only enough for one, and it is yours, you are allowed to keep yourself alive first. If you have enough for two, you are obligated to share enough for two so that the other person survives too. even though you say, oh, but I like taking a shower. No, you are obligated. Once you have enough to protect yourself, you are obligated to also keep the other person from dying. So he's using that as proof that loving someone else as yourself doesn't mean you just lock arms and say, well, the desert looks like it's too long for both of us, so I guess we'll just sit down and die. I'm sorry, but I've got to get to my family on the other side, and I do have enough water because the bandit stole yours. I'll send help as quickly as I can, or maybe we'll find something, whatever, but the water's staying with me. Onward.
The Torah here enjoins us that we should wish upon our neighbor the same benefits that we wish upon ourselves. Indeed, sometimes a person may wish upon his neighbor certain benefits, only wealth, but not wisdom, and the like.
All right, so the first thing he's trying to say is when we think of others, we should think about them, we should wish for them, we should pray for them, the same sorts of things that we would like, right? I would like health, I would like safety, I would like prosperity, I would like happiness. Therefore, I wish those for others as well. And I should wish all of them. Because he's arguing, yeah, sometimes some people say, oh, I hope my neighbor's prosperous, but I'm not really thinking so much about wisdom on his behalf. For myself, of course, I pray for wisdom, but it just never really occurred to me to wish him wisdom. You should, he's saying. You should wish the whole gamut. And furthermore,
but even if he wishes his cherished friend well in everything, wealth, honor, learning, and wisdom, he will not do so unstintingly. He will still insist on a larger share of the benefits. It is this shortcoming that the Torah condemned.
Right? So your best friend, you wish them well. Do you really wish them as well as you? Now, notice what he's saying. You're not required to provide for them as well as yourself. But in your prayers, do you really hope they will be as successful as you, as wise as you, as respected as you? And if you don't, that's why the Torah is trying to get your attention. Because you should, at the very least, be wishing for them everything you wish for yourself and in equal measure that you would hope for yourself. Or else you're not loving them as yourself. And that's hard. I know it may sound easy. Oh, of course, I wish my best friend to be successful in everything. But aren't there corners of our mind that hold out the small idea that I'll be slightly more successful, have a slightly nicer car, have a slightly, happier marriage? Not that I wish them badly, but I reserve the best blessings for myself. Right? It's just little corners of our mind that have these tints of envy and jealousy and competitiveness.
Well, isn't that because of self-preservation?
Because if they ended up with a better car than me, I would starve?
No, it's human nature to feel, to want for yourself more than, even though you have well wishes that, this other person or friends or whoever prosper as well.
Exactly.
But it's human nature to think of yourself, I think, first.
Thank you for the word. Human nature. You're right. And being holy is about exceeding human nature. You're right. We start with human nature. And human nature has some good points and it has some really rotten points. And Torah allows us to embellish and to polish what is good and to diminish or eventually even conquer what is wrong. And excusing what is wrong as being human nature is missing the point of what Torah has called us to do. Because Torah doesn't say you don't have that nature, you don't have those impulses, you don't have those dark corners of your mind. It says you're better than them. And you can prevent them from ruling your life, and especially prevent them from ruining your life.
I think, when I'm listening to this, I'm thinking, my goodness, if you have everything you need, why wouldn't you want your friends to have the same thing?
And yet we know that
to me, it doesn't compute. Now, if you're in dire straits, then it's a different story. But when you're in a comfortable situation and all your needs are being satisfied, wouldn't you want the same for your friends and those around you? It makes for more evenness and peace and happiness.
Yes, but if you go back to Shadal and to general society, there is often a feeling of a zero-sum game, that others do well at some expense to me. That for someone else to truly reach my status or reach my level of blessing somehow diminishes me, or somehow puts a pressure on me, or somehow detracts from my social standing, or the position I occupy among our circle of friends. That there's 100 different, tiny or huge, forms of damage that I can suffer by someone else's good fortune.
That's a petty, evil person.
Well, I'll give you petty. I wouldn't say evil,
Okay.
because but it's a pettiness, but it's a pettiness that is pervasive.
Again, we get back to Evie's word of human nature.
Mm-hmm. Of course, in a life of scarcity, when we were villagers that were fighting over a little bit of rough land to grow our wheat in, and a few acres that were safe enough to graze your sheep. Every sheep you had meant less grass on that piece of earth for my sheep to eat, which meant less lamb or wool for me to gather. I understand why I would begrudge you your success, because your success really would come in a very obvious way at the expense of my own success. But when you live, as you were mentioning, in an abundant state, where you have everything you could possibly want, you should release. But that human nature holds us back. It makes us constantly check scores, even about things that shouldn't be counted, like the number of friends on Facebook, the number of followers on Twitter, the number of cards you get for your birthday, or that you send for other people's birthdays during the year to show how big your circle of friends are, the length of your vacation compared to others so that you can seem more worldly. It's so many things we rank in order to have that standing, because we're just used to looking at the world from our primitive days. Primitive meaning, yesterday. We're used to constantly ranking to make sure that everything is going right, that we are being treated fairly, and we're not going to be without, that we're not going to be, left without enough dirt for our field and enough grass for our lambs. And because we have that built-in tendency, love doesn't come easy, right? We begrudge others, even things that we know we shouldn't. And the Torah tells us, quit it. Stop it. And it gives us ways to do that. We began with a whole series of ways of burying those, of taking care of the sick, of helping the poor. We've seen a number in this parasha, but the Torah is there to help us overcome that tendency. And let's go ahead and finish up, Edie, because we're going to get a few more bits of that. We're going to show, first of all, one beautiful example.
Rather, a man should wish his fellow well in everything, just as he does in his own case, and he should place no limitations on his love. Therefore, in the case of Jonathan and David,
which Hannah read beautifully during the Haftarah. Sorry.
It says that Jonathan loved him as his own soul, since he had removed all jealousy from his heart, declaring, "And you shall rule over Israel."
Right, so imagine the love it takes to wish that someone else would be king instead of you. That's the ideal. And Jonathan lived up to it. And from Rabbi Hirsch, we finish up with one of the famous parts of his 19 letters.
The mitzvah furthermore tend to ennoble your inner character, that it become pure and free of all that could drag you down from the high pinnacle of your holy mission. They push you to put aside pride and desire of sensual pleasure, to respond sympathetically to the sorrow or joy of all things, and to embrace them all in your love as children of your God. These injunctions are but the applications of the principles demonstrated as true in the revelation given in the actions, in the mighty deeds of God.
All right, let me just make sure that everyone follow that sentence, because it's a little confusing. right? That the mitzvot that we are told, right? That's what he means by injunctions. These mitzvot are the application of the principles of kindness and goodness and love that are demonstrated through the commandments, through the deeds of God. So as God acts, so too do we act. As God has shown himself to be merciful, kind, and loving, so too we learn those principles through God's actions. And those principles are also embodied within the commandments themselves.
His commandments are but the expressions of these principles, revealed as concepts, not as mere incomprehensible commands. Whoever desires truth will accept them.
Right? It's one thing to just say, love your neighbor as yourself. It's another thing to spend an hour, like we have, or a lifetime, trying to apply that through the concrete commands of Torah and our people. And by doing so, says Rabbi Hirsch, we refine our inner spirit. We make ourselves pure and free from that which would drag us down from our holy mission.
Sometimes we're better at it than others.
And sometimes we hit home runs, and sometimes we get to plate and we strike out miserably. But there's always the footage to review and figure out how we can do better for the next time and how to make amends for our own failings. But the idea of overcoming those human nature elements which drag us down, that try to keep the narrative of living in a life of brutal competition, of zero-sum games, of antagonism towards other people's success, that is one of the pillars of Torah's mission. And that came 3,000 years ago to a people living with nothing, who would have had the worst of scarcity in their society. And that's where we began. We should be able to do it even better than they did, because we live with an abundance that would stagger them. Even the poorest among us in this country live with an abundance that would stagger the ancients. And yet sometimes our callousness would have surprised them as well. Because they lived in closer knit groups, in tighter communities, by necessity as well as desire, the idea that you would ignore someone else in need, that you would not celebrate together with them, that you would not bury the dead together with them, they would be dumbfounded. So we still got work to do. We've conquered one aspect, the abundant side. Now we just have to conquer the love and do it right. All right, take care, everyone.